there's a story they don't teach in schools. A story about a black man born into slavery who taught himself to read when it was literally a crime punishable by death. A man who built a flying machine in a barn behind his house in Pineville, Louisiana, and got his patent approved before the Wright Brothers got theirs. His name was Charles Frederick Paige, and if you've never heard of him, that's not an accident, that's by design. And by the time you finish this story, you're going to understand exactly why his name was erased from history while others became legends. Let me take you back, way back, to 1864, right in the middle of the Civil War. Somewhere in Louisiana, either in Rapides Parish or Caddo Parish, depending on which records you trust, a baby boy was born. His name was Charles Frederick Paige. He came into this world as property, not a person, property, because that's what slavery was. It stripped you of your humanity before you even took your first breath. Now, here's something most people don't understand about slavery. It wasn't just about forced labor. It was about control. Total, absolute control over every aspect of a person's existence. And one of the most effective ways to maintain that control was through ignorance. If you keep people from learning to read, you keep them from understanding contracts, laws, newspapers, anything that might give them power or knowledge, or the ability to question the system that enslaved them. That's why it was illegal to teach enslaved people to read and write. In some southern states, the laws were explicit and brutal. In South Carolina, the law stated that anyone who taught a slave to read or write could be fined $100 and imprisoned for 6 months. In North Carolina, teaching a slave to read or write, or giving them any book or pamphlet, was punishable by 39 lashes on the back if the teacher was free black, or a fine if they were white. In Georgia, the punishment for teaching slaves to read could include whipping or imprisonment. And if you were an enslaved person caught trying to learn, the punishments were even worse. Whippings that left permanent scars, mutilation, having fingers cut off, being sold away from your family. In some cases, death. The message was clear, and it was enforced with violence. Stay ignorant, or suffer the consequences. Charles Frederick Paige was born into that system, a system that told him from day one that he was less than human, that his mind didn't matter, that his dreams were irrelevant, that his only purpose was to work until his body gave out. But something inside him rejected that narrative completely. We don't know exactly when or how it started, but at some point, young Charles decided he was going to learn to read. Not in a classroom, not with a teacher, in secret, in the shadows, risking his life every single day just to understand the written word. Think about that for a second. Imagine being so hungry for knowledge, so determined to prove your humanity, so desperate to understand the world beyond the narrow confines of slavery, that you'd risk being beaten to death just to learn your ABCs. That's not just about education. That's about dignity. That's about refusing to accept the role that's been forced on you. That's rebellion in its purest form. He taught himself. Nobody knows exactly how. Maybe he found scraps of newspapers that white people had thrown away and studied the letters, matching sounds to symbols. Maybe he watched white children from a distance during their lessons and memorized what they were learning. Maybe someone, perhaps a sympathetic white person or another enslaved person who already knew how to read, took pity on him and taught him in secret, risking their own safety. Maybe it was a combination of all of these. Whatever the method, Charles Frederick Paige learned to read and write, and that act of self-education, that refusal to stay ignorant, that rejection of the limitations placed on him by a brutal system, set the foundation for everything that came after. The Civil War ended in 1865. Charles was barely a year old. President Abraham Lincoln had signed the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1, 1863, declaring that all enslaved people in Confederate states were free. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution, ratified on December 6, 1865, officially abolished slavery throughout the entire United States. Suddenly, 4 million black people in America were free. Except they weren't. Not really. Freedom without resources, without land, without education, without protection under the law, that's not freedom. That's just a different kind of trap. The South responded to emancipation with a system designed to keep black people exactly where they'd been before. Sharecropping arrangements that kept families in endless debt. convict leasing programs that turned prisons into slavery by another name, Jim Crow laws that segregated every part of life and stripped away the rights that Reconstruction had briefly granted, and violence. Constant, relentless, systematic violence. Between 1877, when Reconstruction officially ended, and 1950, there were approximately 4,743 documented lynchings of black people in the United States. That's just the ones that were recorded. The real number is likely much higher. These weren't random acts of violence. They were public spectacles, often attended by hundreds or thousands of white people, including children. They were designed to send one message: know your place. Charles Frederick Paige grew up in that world. He survived it, and somehow, against all odds, he began to dream of something most people couldn't even imagine. He started dreaming of flight. Now, we need to talk about what inspired him, because this detail is too perfect to be made up. According to his family, according to the stories passed down through generations, Charles Frederick Paige would sit for hours watching what he called mosquito hawks. That's the southern name for dragonflies. Not just glancing at them, studying them, observing every movement, every twist, every hover, every sudden burst of speed. His grandson, Joseph Paige, was interviewed decades later, and he remembered the stories his father and grandfather told. He said, Charles would sit in the Louisiana heat, sometimes for entire afternoons, just watching these insects move through the air, like they were defying gravity itself. While other men were working in the fields or chopping wood or doing whatever labor they could find to survive, Charles Frederick Paige was studying the physics of flight. Most people see a dragonfly and think nothing of it. Charles Frederick Paige saw a blueprint. He saw the future. He saw possibility. And he started asking himself a question that would consume the rest of his life. If a tiny insect can fly, why can't a human? He wasn't the first person to ask that question, of course. People had been dreaming of flight for centuries, maybe for as long as humans have existed. Every culture has myths about flying. Icarus in Greek mythology, who flew too close to the sun on wings made of feathers and wax. The Chinese legend of Lu Ban, who supposedly built a wooden bird that could fly. Native American stories about shapeshifters who could become birds. Flight has always represented freedom, escape, the ability to rise above earthly limitations. But actually achieving it, that was different. Leonardo da Vinci, the Italian polymath, had sketched flying machines in the 1400s. His notebooks, which weren't discovered until centuries later, showed designs for ornithopters, machines with flapping wings modeled after birds. He understood the principles of aerodynamics in ways that were centuries ahead of his time. But he never built a working flying machine. The technology didn't exist. The materials weren't strong enough. The power sources weren't available. In 1783, the Montgolfier brothers in France launched the first successful hot air balloon, carrying animals and then humans into the sky. That was a breakthrough, proof that humans could leave the ground. But balloons just floated wherever the wind took them. They couldn't be steered or controlled with any real precision. By the late 1800s, when Charles Frederick Paige was growing up, progress was being made. George Cayley in England had figured out the basic principles of aerodynamics, understanding that flight required lift, thrust, and control. Otto Lilienthal in Germany was building gliders and making thousands of successful flights. Samuel Langley in the United States was experimenting with powered models, but controlled, powered, sustained flight with a human on board, that was still a dream. The technology didn't exist yet. The materials weren't advanced enough. The science wasn't fully understood. And most importantly, the people working on it were almost exclusively wealthy, educated white men with access to funding, resources, universities, laboratories, and networks of other scientists and engineers who could help them. Charles Frederick Paige was none of those things. He was a black man in Jim Crow, Louisiana. He had no formal education beyond what he'd taught himself. No engineering degree, no university laboratory access, no wealthy backers, no team of assistants. What he had was a barn behind his house, a mind that refused to quit, and an obsession with solving the impossible. In 1880, when he was about 16 years old, Charles married a woman named Ida Kelso. We don't know much about Ida. The historical record on black women from this era is even more sparse than the record on black men. But we know she married Charles and we know they settled in Pineville, Louisiana, a small town in Rapides Parish, and we know they would have 13 children together over the years. 13. Imagine raising 13 children in Jim Crow, Louisiana, while your husband is obsessed with building a flying machine. Imagine the financial strain, the constant worry, the whispers from neighbors who probably thought Charles was crazy. Imagine the faith it took to support him anyway. Charles worked every job he could find to support his family. He was a timberman, cutting and hauling logs for the timber industry. Louisiana was thick with pine forests, and the lumber industry was booming. It was brutal work. Long hours in the heat and humidity, wielding axes and saws, dragging massive logs through swamps and forests, risking injury every single day. Men lost fingers, hands, sometimes their lives when trees fell the wrong way or equipment failed. He was a coal digger, doing back-breaking work in mines or hauling coal for heating and industrial use. He was a botanical farmer, growing crops to feed his family and maybe sell at market. He was a charcoal producer, a job that required cutting wood, stacking it in special mounds, burning it slowly in low-oxygen conditions to turn it into charcoal, then selling it for cooking and heating. He was a carpenter, making cabinets and furniture, work that required precision and skill and an understanding of how materials behave. He did whatever it took to survive, and in whatever spare time he had, in the hours after work when other men might rest or socialize or sleep, Charles Frederick Paige was working on his airship. Not an airplane, an airship. And this is a crucial distinction that most people miss, and it's important to understand because it changes the entire conversation about whether Charles Frederick Paige invented flight before the Wright Brothers. He didn't invent an airplane. The Wright Brothers invented the first successful controlled, powered, heavier-than-air flying machine. That's an airplane. What Charles Frederick Paige invented was an airship, which is a lighter-than-air craft that uses balloons filled with gas to achieve lift, combined with engines and propellers for propulsion and control. Airships had been around for a while. The first successful airship flight happened in 1852 when Henry Giffard flew a steam-powered airship in France. He traveled about 17 miles at an average speed of about 6 miles per hour. It was a major achievement, proof that you could power and steer a lighter-than-air craft. But those early airships were dangerous, unstable, and hard to control. The technology was primitive. Steam engines were heavy and inefficient. The envelopes that held the gas were fragile. Steering mechanisms were rudimentary. Paige's innovation wasn't in inventing the airship, it was in improving it. According to his patent, which we'll get to in a moment, he designed a biballooned airship, meaning it had 2 balloons instead of 1. This made it more stable because if one balloon lost gas or deflated, the other could keep it aloft. He added a rudder for steering, modeled after the design of a sailboat, allowing for more precise control. And he included a gas-powered propeller for propulsion, giving it the ability to move against the wind instead of just drifting with it. His design addressed the 3 biggest problems with early airships: stability, control, and power. And he did all of this in a barn behind his house in Pineville, Louisiana, with no formal training and limited resources. Between 1899 and 1903, Charles Frederick Paige built a full-scale working model of his airship. Think about that timeline for a second. 4 years. 4 years of designing, testing, failing, redesigning, building, spending money he didn't have, working late into the night after already working all day at whatever job was paying him. 4 years of his wife Ida managing 13 children and a household while her husband chased a dream that probably seemed impossible to everyone around them. We don't have detailed records of what those 4 years looked like. We don't know how many times he failed before he succeeded. We don't know how he sourced materials, how he learned to work with fabric strong enough to hold gas, how he figured out the chemistry of creating and storing hydrogen, how he built an engine light enough to power the airship without weighing it down too much. What we do know is that by 1903, he had built something that worked, a full-scale airship that could lift off the ground, be steered, and be powered by an engine. His family saw it. His neighbors saw it. It existed. It flew. On April 24, 1903, Charles Frederick Paige filed a patent application with the United States Patent Office for his airship. Let that date sit with you for a moment. April 24, 1903. That's 8 months before the Wright brothers flew their airplane at Kitty Hawk on December 17, 1903. 8 months. Now, the Wright brothers had also filed a patent application earlier that year, on March 23, 1903, about a month before Paige filed his. But here's the thing. Filing a patent doesn't mean you get the patent right away. The patent office has to review it, verify that it's original, check that it doesn't infringe on existing patents, make sure it meets all the legal requirements. That process can take months or even years. Charles Frederick Paige's patent was approved on April 10, 1906. Patent number 816,189. You can look it up. It's in the public record. The Wright brothers' patent for their flying machine was approved on May 22, 1906. Patent number 821,393. That means Charles Frederick Paige, a black man born into slavery, a man who taught himself to read when it was illegal, a man who built a flying machine in a barn with no formal education, received his patent 42 days before the Wright brothers got theirs. Let me say that again because it's important. 42 days. Charles Frederick Paige's patent was official on April 10th. The Wright brothers' patent was official on May 22nd. For 42 days, Charles Frederick Paige was a patent holder for a flying machine, and the Wright brothers were not. And yet, whose names do you know? Whose invention is in the Smithsonian? Whose story is taught in every elementary school in America? The Wright brothers. Orville and Wilbur Wright. Their names are synonymous with flight. Their airplane hangs from the ceiling of the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. Millions of people visit it every year, taking photos, marveling at the machine that changed transportation forever. Charles Frederick Paige. His name was erased. His invention disappeared. And for over 100 years, almost nobody knew he existed. Let's talk about what happened next, because this is where the story becomes not just about one man's genius, but about the systematic destruction of black achievement in America. In 1904, while his patent application was still pending, Charles Frederick Paige made a decision that would change his life. He was going to show the world what he'd built. The Louisiana Purchase Exposition was being held in St. Louis, Missouri, that year. It was one of the biggest events of the decade, maybe one of the biggest events in American history up to that point. The fair was massive. It covered 1,200 acres, an area almost 2 square miles. That's bigger than the entire downtown core of most American cities at the time. There were over 1,500 buildings connected by 75 miles of roads and walkways. Nearly 20 million people visited during the 7 months it was open, from April 30th to December 1st, 1904. The fair celebrated the 100th anniversary of the Louisiana Purchase, when the United States bought 828,000 square miles of territory from France in 1803, doubling the size of the country overnight. But it was more than just a historical commemoration. It was a showcase of American progress, American power, American innovation. It was the United States telling the world, look what we've become. Countries from all over the world sent exhibits. 62 nations participated. 43 of the then 45 American states had pavilions. There were displays of new technology, new inventions, new ideas. X-ray machines that could see inside the human body. Baby incubators that could save premature infants. Electric typewriters. Early fax machines called teletographs. Wireless telegraphy. And most exciting of all, demonstrations of flying machines. The fair organizers knew that flight was the next frontier. They set up a special section called the Aeronautic Concourse, a 14-acre area leased from Washington University, where flying machines could be demonstrated and tested. And they announced a prize, $100,000 to anyone who could build a self-propelled flying machine that could maintain a flight speed of at least 20 miles per hour and complete a triangular 1-mile course, returning to the starting point. $100,000 in 1904. That's the equivalent of about $3.4 million today. For a man like Charles Frederick Paige, who'd spent his entire life scraping by, working brutal jobs to feed his family of 15, that money would have been transformational, life-changing. It would have meant financial security. It would have meant he could stop digging coal and cutting timber and hauling logs and focus full-time on his inventions. It would have meant his children could go to school, could get educations, could have opportunities he never had. It would have meant everything. The competition drew entries from around the world. Alberto Santos Dumont, a Brazilian aviation pioneer living in Paris, was expected to compete. He was already famous in Europe for flying dirigibles around the Eiffel Tower and winning prizes for aerial demonstrations. He built an airship specifically for the St. Louis competition, a massive craft 164 feet long with a capacity of 44,500 cubic feet of hydrogen. Santos Dumont shipped his airship to St. Louis, and it arrived by train on June 26 in 3 large crates, each weighing 2 tons. But on the morning of June 28, disaster struck. One of Santos Dumont's mechanics discovered 4-yard-long slashes in the gas bag, obviously made by a knife. Someone had sabotaged it. The fair organizers offered a $1,000 reward for information leading to the culprit, but no one was ever caught. Santos Dumont, devastated and suspicious, left for Paris without repairing the airship or competing. That wasn't the only incident of sabotage at the fair. Tensions were high. The prize was enormous. Competitors were protective of their designs and paranoid about rivals stealing their ideas. The whole event was charged with the kind of anxiety that comes when you're competing for something that could make you rich and famous overnight. Into this environment, Charles Frederick Paige sent his airship. He didn't deliver it himself. For reasons that aren't entirely clear from the historical record, he chose to have it shipped. Maybe he couldn't afford the trip to St. Louis. Travel was expensive, and a black man traveling alone through the Jim Crow South risked violence at every stop. Maybe he had to work and couldn't leave his family for weeks or months. Maybe he thought it would be safer to ship the airship than to accompany it. Whatever the reason, he packed up his life's work, his dream, the flying machine he'd spent years building, the invention that could win him $100,000 and change his family's future forever, and he sent it to St. Louis. It never arrived. The airship disappeared, vanished, gone, no trace. No explanation, no apology from the shipping company, no investigation that led anywhere, just gone. Eva Paige, Charles's daughter, was interviewed in 1974 by a reporter from the Alexandria Daily Town Talk, a local Louisiana newspaper. By then, she was an elderly woman, but she remembered what happened, and she didn't mince words. She said, "It was stolen. After that, Papa never built another one. Stolen. Not lost in transit. Not damaged beyond repair. Not delayed and returned later. Stolen. And if you know anything about the Jim Crow era, if you understand the level of hatred and violence directed at black people who dared to be successful, who dared to be innovative, who dared to challenge the narrative that they were inferior, then you know exactly why that airship disappeared." Charles Frederick Paige was a black man who had invented something extraordinary. He was about to showcase it on a world stage in front of millions of people. He was about to compete for a prize that would make him wealthy. He was about to prove, in the most public way possible, that a formerly enslaved black man could create technology that rivaled anything white inventors were producing. And someone, or multiple someones, decided that could not be allowed to happen. Historian Michael Wynn, who has spent years researching Charles Frederick Paige's life and trying to reconstruct what happened to the airship, says it plainly. Due to the Jim Crow prejudice of that time, we firmly believe that it was stolen and destroyed. There's no hard proof, no confession, no signed letter from someone admitting they took it, but the pattern is undeniable. During the Jim Crow era, black success was a threat, not just to individual white people who might lose a competition or a contract, but to the entire social order that depended on black people being seen as inferior. If you were black and you owned a successful business, white mobs might burn it down. This happened in places like Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, when a prosperous black neighborhood called Greenwood, known as Black Wall Street, was destroyed by white rioters. Hundreds of black-owned businesses, churches, schools, and homes were burned to the ground. Hundreds of people were killed. Thousands were left homeless. Why? Because black people in Greenwood had become too successful, too prosperous, too visible. They had banks, theaters, newspapers, luxury stores, and white people couldn't stand it. If you were black and you accumulated wealth, you might be lynched and your property seized. This happened to countless black farmers, business owners, and landowners across the South. White people would accuse them of some fabricated crime, form a mob, murder them, and then take everything they owned. There was no legal recourse. no justice, no accountability. If you were black and you invented something valuable, white people might steal it, patent it under their own names, and profit from your genius while you got nothing. This happened over and over and over and over. Let me tell you about some of them, because Charles Frederick Paige's story doesn't exist in isolation. His experience was part of a pattern, part of a system designed to suppress black innovation and transfer wealth and credit to white people. Granville T. Woods was born in Columbus, Ohio, in 1856. He was a self-taught electrical and mechanical engineer who created over 50 devices related to electrical systems, trains, and communication. He invented the synchronous multiplex railway telegraph, which allowed moving trains to communicate with each other and with stations, dramatically reducing collisions and improving safety. He invented an automatic air brake system for trains. He developed improvements to electric railway systems that made streetcars more efficient. Thomas Edison tried to take credit for some of Woods' inventions. Edison sued Woods twice for patent infringement, claiming that Woods had stolen Edison's ideas. Both times, the courts ruled in favor of Woods, confirming that he was the true inventor. But the lawsuits were expensive and time-consuming, and they tarnished Woods' reputation even though he won. Later, Edison offered to hire Woods, probably hoping to control his future inventions. Woods declined and continued working independently, but he struggled financially for most of his life despite his brilliance. Garrett Morgan was born in Kentucky in 1877 to formerly enslaved parents. He moved to Cleveland, Ohio, and became a successful businessman and inventor. In 1914, he patented a safety hood, an early gas mask that could protect people from smoke and toxic fumes. It had a tube that reached down to the ground where the air was cleaner, allowing firefighters and rescue workers to breathe in situations that would otherwise kill them. But when Morgan tried to market his invention, especially in the South, he faced a problem. If people knew a black man had invented it, they wouldn't buy it. So he hired a white actor to pose as the inventor. Morgan would attend demonstrations pretending to be the actor's assistant, sometimes dressing up as a Native American character he called Big Chief Mason to disguise his race. This strategy worked, and municipal fire departments across the country bought his safety hoods. But Morgan himself remained largely anonymous. Then in 1916, an explosion trapped workers in a tunnel under Lake Erie in Cleveland. Rescuers couldn't reach them because of toxic fumes. Morgan and his brother, wearing his safety hoods, went into the tunnel and saved several men. The story made national news, and suddenly, people knew that a black man had invented the device. Sales in the South dropped immediately. Cities that had been buying his product refused to purchase any more. Morgan's moment of heroism cost him business. He also invented the three-position traffic signal, the one with red, yellow, and green lights that we still use today. He sold the rights to General Electric for $40,000, which sounds like a lot, but was far less than the invention was worth. General Electric made millions from it. Lewis Latimer was born in 1848 in Chelsea, Massachusetts, to parents who had escaped slavery. He taught himself mechanical drawing and became a draftsman. He worked with Alexander Graham Bell and helped draft the patent drawings for Bell's telephone. Later, he worked with Thomas Edison and made crucial improvements to the light bulb. Edison's early light bulbs burned out quickly because the carbon filaments inside them were fragile and inefficient. Latimer, working with Joseph Nichols, developed a method for manufacturing carbon filaments that lasted much longer. This made electric lighting practical and affordable. Without Latimer's contribution, Edison's light bulb would have remained a curiosity rather than a world-changing invention. But when people talk about who invented the light bulb, they say Edison. Latimer's name is rarely mentioned. Sarah Boone was born enslaved in North Carolina in 1832. After the Civil War, she moved to New Haven, Connecticut. In 1892, she patented an improved ironing board that was narrower, curved, and reversible, making it much easier to iron clothes, especially women's garments with sleeves and curves. Her design is the basis for the ironing boards we use today, but most people have never heard of her. Benjamin Montgomery was born into slavery in 1819. He invented a steamboat propeller designed for shallow waters, which was incredibly valuable because steamboats at the time often got stuck in rivers and bayous, delaying the delivery of food and supplies. Montgomery tried to apply for a patent, but his application was rejected because he was enslaved and therefore not legally a person. His owner then tried to patent the invention, claiming it as his own, but the patent office rejected that application too because the owner wasn't the true inventor. So an invention that could have made someone wealthy and improved river transportation was never patented at all. Ned, whose last name we don't even know, was an enslaved man who invented an improved cotton scraper. His owner took credit for it, patented it, and made money from it while Ned got nothing. This happened countless times during slavery. Enslaved people created tools, techniques, and inventions that made their owners richer, but the law prevented them from owning anything, including their own ideas. Mary Kenner was born in 1912 in Monroe, North Carolina. She was one of the most prolific black female inventors in American history, holding 5 patents. In 1957, she patented the sanitary belt, a device designed to prevent menstrual blood from staining clothing. The Son-Napak Company contacted her, excited about marketing the invention. Then they found out she was black